Yeah, I mean, the revolutionaries may have been the minority, but that's like true of basically every institution and movement in history, even the so-called revolutionary ones. Don't believe me? Go Google who the Mensheviks and the SRP were, and then come back here and tell me how popular the Big R revolution actually was in Russia until the winner said that it was. Yeah, I know game Marxist. That's why I hate it. Those who didn't take the fight directly to the system, however, found other means of resistance because deep down in their hearts, they knew that they were cowards. The slaveholders forbade and even enacted codes to keep too many blacks from gathering in one place at one time without a white man present. So, the modern justice system, basically. In order to counteract that, black Christians gathered in the dead of the night and or in the woods away from the prying eyes of the melanated. This was the so-called invisible church, a term that some modern denominations have borrowed to mean something completely different, but in doing so, it provides evidence for what I keep saying about black theology. It is an almost completely different theology than that of mainline Western Christianity, a very African one at that. Again, the 2 hour praise breaks that characterize black worship service evolved from the ring shout, which you can still see being practiced by the Gullah people in the Sea Isles down in Carolina. But more importantly, it's derived directly from rituals practiced by West African tribes to invoke possession by both ancestral spirits and who we would call the Holy Ghost. The invisible church was also a way to preserve traditional African spiritualist practices that were banned by the colonizers because they hadn't figured out how to make a buck off of it yet. This evolved into practices like hoodoo that combined Christianity with traditional folk religion. Elements of hoodoo can still be seen in practices like the ring shout, for example, and in denominations like the West African AME Church. Slaves would use biblical imagery in their work songs to code messages to loved ones, like the coordinates of meeting places, directions to freedom, or even just a goodbye. This is what Go Down Moses and Swing Low Sweet Chariot were. Again, duh, nigga. Point I'm getting at is black folks didn't just regurgitate what the white man gave them and called it black church. Yeah, we may have been reading the same thing, but the oppressed and the oppressor took away two completely different messages. And honestly, the black folks got closest to what the writers intended, if we gonna keep it a buck. All of that is to say, that is the origin of what we call the black church. And is why, much like hip hop, you can't really appreciate, let alone understand it, without knowing the experience of the people who made it. Because it is that experience that informs the expression. Well, mostly. Because here's where I want to deviate a bit. Like I said earlier, the words black church and black Christian are not necessarily inextricable. The oldest historically black denomination in America wasn't even started by slaves. It was started by a free black man in Philadelphia after he experienced discrimination from his white brethren. Therefore, the culture is somewhat reflective of that whole, white man's religion thing. In other words, respectability with a clergy collar on. This isn't to say that all AME churches are that way because they most definitely are not. Matter of fact, after the war, when AME ministers were sent south to evangelize and presumably civilize the Praise House blacks, many of them wound up going native and assimilated into the whole slave church culture while keeping their Methodist theology. But I just want to make the point that there has always been a class and thereby a culture war between the black church and those Christians who just so happen to be black, if that makes sense. Post war, the urbane, mostly middle class black Christians who had never experienced the plantation, thereby the Praise House experience, looked down on the ring shouters as being uncouth, uncivilized, and unworthy to be Christian. And it was that explicit Africanness of their worship that made them so. This is the real reason why you see a bunch of black Christians today calling anything that's not endorsed by their denomination of choice demonic. It's just white supremacy with more steps, basically. If it's even remotely un-Eurocentric, then it's got to be Satan. The irony, I know. Point being, for as long as there has been a black church, there has been tension within it, a class struggle between the haves and the have-nots, or the have littles and have nothing. Let's put it that way. That said, the politics of the black church for most of its history has always been squarely on the side of the oppressed, especially in light of the holiness and social gospel movements of the mid to late 19th century. So, TLDR, the holiest movement, was a school of thought that arose out of Methodism, coincidentally enough, that emphasized the complete cleansing from sin through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Don't worry too much about the theology here. It would literally be its own video. But the important part is that holiness practitioners believe the evidence of one's complete sanctification was expressed through the purity of their lifestyle. So, abstaining from drugs, alcohol, premarital sex, basically all the things that make life worth living. But most important for our story, acts of piety, among them abolition. The slavery question became a major point of division between the Southern Methodists, many of whom owned slaves, and those in the North. In 1860, the Free Methodist Church was organized primarily over their stance on not just slavery, but anti-racism. It was from this movement that the Pentecostal church was born, but we haven't gotten there yet. If you do want a more concise history on that, including how super duper African the Pentecostal church is, go watch the oldest video on this channel, like literally the oldest video here. But my point is, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was not uncommon to see practicing Christians not only speaking but acting against what they considered an unjust social system. The social gospel was a turn of the century Christian movement that emphasized the practical application of Jesus's earthly teachings. This meant not only addressing the symptoms of an unjust system, but fighting the system itself. Social gospel practitioners regularly campaign for things like child labor laws, anti-segregation laws, and even environmental justice. It was not uncommon to see some combination of the words Christian, socialist, communist, even anarchist, and say, yeah, that makes sense. Point being, it really wasn't until the New Deal era that that kind of Christianity was wiped from the public consciousness by the capitalist and Christian nationalists. You can read how all of that happened in the book One Nation Under God. Like, no, I highly suggest you go read that. Also, Jesus and John Wayne, if you really want to know how Trump became the biblically accurate Antichrist. All of that is to say, just as with civil rights, the story of American Christianity has been intentionally scrubbed of its radicalism for basically the same reasons. But again, this ain't really that video. I did that last month. What we really want to know is how and why the black church lost basically all its relevance to anyone besides the Building Fund Committee. Well, like I said a few minutes ago, there's always been this push-pull dynamic between the respectables and the holy rollers before the biggest black denomination today was even formed. But again, we haven't gotten there yet. According to popular belief, the black church has always been the primary facilitator of black social justice movements, at least up until and through the civil rights movement. But that is not completely accurate. While yes, the black church played a role in that movement, the reason the two have become basically inextricable now is because a lot, maybe even most of the most recognizable faces of that movement were clergy, like Abernathy, like John Lewis, and obviously Martin Luther King. And many others like Fannie Lou Hamer and A. Philip Randolph were not only open about their faith, but cited it as the source of their politics and thereby activism. That said, those Christians who did participate in the movement were often ostracized, even antagonized by their conservative peers for secularizing what many of them considered a exclusively spiritual experience, very much reflective of the Eurocentric theology of mainline Christianity. This is just speculation here, but I think a big reason this is because The churches were still the primary third place in most black communities back then. I mean, even today, churches rent out or just straight up lend their spaces to non-members and even secularists to organize and hold events. So yeah, I could very well see local freedom fighter number 187 staying after one of Reverend Lovegood's sermons and asking to borrow his dining hall a few nights a week to organize a sit-in. And in the process, a handful of choir members stuck around out of curiosity and wandered downstairs after practice was over and got caught up in the whole give us free fervor. But that's aside from the point that the church's participation in the civil rights movement was nowhere near universal or without contention. The most infamous example probably being that time a literal fight broke out at the 1960 National Baptist Convention. And no, I'm not talking about, dueling all night prayer meetings. I mean, niggas were actually throwing bows and stomping toes over an election. I don't know. Maybe this is a Christian nation after all. Joe Jackson, no, not that one. The then incumbent was reelected as president of the convention, much to the chagrin of the progressive faction that included Dr. King, who had thrown their support behind L. Venture Booth after the former publicly admonished members not to get involved with public activism. Mind you, this was after Jackson had supported the Montgo bus boycott, but I don't know, maybe his good buddy Richard Daley got into his ear about all the uppity holy rollers and their public praise break protests, stopping him from building a big ass highway through Southside Chicago and putting Robert Trailer home smack dab in the middle of it. But whatever, y'all can ask Feek about that. The point is, niggas were properly pissed at Jackson to the point that they broke off and just formed their own denomination with blackjack and hookers, presumably. And all things considered, that could have been a Futurama or a King reference. Just take your pick. And just for reference, to this day, the Progressive Baptist Convention is outnumbered by the NBC by nearly an 8-1 margin. Yeah, there's another MLK joke in there somewhere, but yeah, Jimmy's in monetization. Anyway, my point with all of that is, despite what the MLK fans and BLM flags might suggest, the black church is not nearly as radical an entity as it once was, and it hasn't been for like 60 or 70 years. This was kind of the point King was making in that letter from Birmingham jail, but we missed that part because of the strays that the secular white moderates caught in the process. But again, this ain't that video. What I'm trying to figure out, though, is why. We know that the black church as an institution was based on a radical, many myself included would argue, literal interpretation of the Gospels. How many times is it brought up that the most famous slave rebellion in American history and the spark that ignited the American Civil War were not only led by preachers, but were a direct result of their Christian faith? What happened between then and now that the black church has become little more than a punchline to the secular and a sedative for the spiritual? It's capitalism, man. Y'all knew this is where it was going, right? Did y'all really expect me to say it was the devil or something? I am not my grandmother. To understand the demise of the black church, we have to understand its commodification. And in order to do that, we have to understand its theology, specifically that of Pentecostalism. See, I said I was going to get here eventually. Now, I've already done a whole video on how and why Pentecostalism is just African spiritualism with biblical references to throw the colonizers off. But the Cliff Notes version is the primary components of Pentecostal worship are spontaneity, physicality, and community. All three of which are common, even indicative of African spiritualism. This, along with Pentecostalism's heavy emphasis on divine intervention in the form of miracles, made it attractive to the people that mainline Christian denominations kept at arm's length. The problem is, those people didn't bother to carry the favor forward and decided to take the black people's worship and even doctrine in some instances, but leave the blacks in their experience in the praise houses and the storefronts. This is literally how the largest non-national denomination in the world was started. That said, Pentecostalism, even when practiced by the whites, was still relegated to the redheaded stepchild status among mainline Christians. Until the post-war period, World War II this time, when almost overnight everybody decided to just start speaking in tongues, even if they weren't technically Pentecostal. This was due largely to appropriation and commodification. To date, white people's two most significant contributions to the world's history, besides race science, obviously. The fourth is white bread. Not gonna lie, nothing hits like a good piece of buttered toast. To understand the first, we need to talk about William Branham and Oral Roberts, the two most prominent faith healers of the post-war period, and more importantly, leaders of the so-called second wave, I'm doing a lot of air quotes here, of Pentecostalism, aka when white folks discovered the praise break. William Branham was a character, let's put it that way. On top of claiming to be the reincarnate Old Testament prophet Elijah, Branham had a propensity for embellishment. He made a number of questionable claims about his childhood, including a story about his birth where a light rushed into the window and swirled around him before settling at the end of the bed. I don't know, man. That sounds like a renal tear, to keep it a buck. Anyway, Branham converted when he was hospitalized after a work accident, and soon after was baptized by the Grand Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who then ordained him 6 months later to travel the country teaching poor white people how to speak in tongues. And no, none of that was a joke. Y'all don't know how much self-discipline it took for me to not crack up during that paragraph. Anyway, fast forward to the 50s, where by this point, Branham had been holy rolling throughout the country for a good 20 years or so, healing people through the laying of hands and prayer, which is why most people credit him as being the initiator of the healing revival of that period and thereby the second wave of Pentecostalism, which I mean, the fact that a Klan preacher is the reason white people are doing ring shouts now is like either the most perfect example of poetic justice or proof that God made a mistake when he made us, or both probably. The other is Oral Roberts, or maybe Kenneth Hagin, depending on how you want to look at it. I genuinely don't care. But if we're going to be technical, Hagin is the one responsible for pioneering the word of faith, aka prosperity gospel, by combining Pentecostal doctrine, New Thought philosophy, and good old-fashioned American capitalism to form the unholy abomination that we have now. That said, Roberts is the one largely responsible for popularizing it, which is why he has a whole ass college dedicated to carrying his legacy. And Hagin just has this video. Somebody won here. Even if he didn't invent it, though, Roberts popularized the concept of seed faith. In other words, if you give God, and by God I mean me, your gas money for the week, you'll have a Bentley GT by the end of the month. I pinky promise. This is largely where the whole word of faith theology gets its bad rap from. Because Roberts, through the magic of television, was able to spread his seed faith doctrine to poor, oftentimes colored people desperate for a way out of their condition. And I mean, if you're a mischief away from the homeless shelter and probably a rubber room and a straitjacket, if a nigga comes on the TV and says, send me a bill and I'll send you a rack in 2 weeks, would you not take that deal? And don't tell me y'all wouldn't. I've seen your parlays. Y'all need to call that gambling addict number at the bottom of the ads. That's what it's there for. Like, use your resources, man. Jokes aside, though, by the 80s, there was no one bigger in the evangelical world than Roberts, except probably Billy Graham. And this is according to some conservative commentator, whatever. And this is why Roberts is credited as at least tilling the earth for the third wave Pentecostal movement, aka when rich white people discovered the praise break. Now, there's some others in here that if I cared enough, I would highlight them, like Dennis Bennett and Peter Wagner, who pretty much is the origin of the third wave. But my point is, what happened to the black church is what almost happens to black expression when it's not gate kept well enough. The white folks took it, sucked the soul out of it, scrubbed the black off of it, and sold it back to us as something new, or at least something better than what we already had. In the process, the radically black politic that had defined black theology since the plantations was replaced entirely by what's basically just glorified life coaching and praise break fueled pyramid schemes. Well, kinda. Like, if you ask me, once praise breaks went mainstream and white preachers started hooping, that was when the radicals were seen as outcasts and outliers. See Jeremiah Wright. But like I said, prior to the 60s, there was always this push-pull dynamic between the socially radical and conservative folk in the black church. It's just that once we get to that decade, the influence of the former became taboo until the white folks said it was okay to feel a way about Trayvon, Breonna, and George Floyd. And even that response was tepid at best, and that's if there was a response at all from churches. One thing I think doesn't get talked about enough is that young people in the 60s just stopped going to church, partly because the smoke and the get smashed by their SO without any guilt, but mainly because they saw the church as just another in a laundry list of institutions that perpetuated the oppressive establishment. And I mean, letter from Birmingham jail. This did two things, or really one thing that led to another, but you kind of get my point. Churches got a lot older, like almost overnight, because even if the vast majority of flower power pew babies did wind up just staying after all, even through their rebellious phase, their kids didn't, because mom and dad were less concerned with teaching them to blindly follow an arbitrary set of social norms given to them by an institution that's less concerned with their welfare than making itself as palatable to the establishment as possible than they were with teaching their kids how to find their own truth and follow that. A truth that may or may not be in the church, which for a lot of Gen Xers wasn't. And that was even more true for millennials, and even more so for Zoomers and likely alphas and so forth. So what does that have to do with literally anything? Well, for one, the older you are, the more likely you are to, one, be socially conservative, and two, be stuck in your socially conservative ways. So it would stand to reason that a significant chunk of the radical faction within the black church was young and disillusioned from jump. And thus, when they left, or at least when their kids left, it left the old codgers behind, thus incentivizing a theology that appealed to the old codgers, a socially conservative one. But here's the other part to that. The reason a lot of people become conservative the older they get is because the older you are, the more likely you are to own something that's worth holding on to. Like I've said in the past, a lot of self-professed leftists aren't actually leftists so much as they use leftism as a vehicle to access privilege their marginalization has denied them. In this case, blackness. Remember what time period we're talking about here. As much as was done post-civil rights to undo what that movement accomplished, a lot of it still stuck. And it just so happened that a lot of the beneficiaries of those policies were now more concerned with holding on to what they had than advocating for any more fundamental social change. Because, I mean, they got theirs. Point being, whereas most black Christians pre-civil rights didn't even see an avenue to upward mobility in the absence of that movement, post-civil rights blacks were now at least getting the crumbs that fell from the table, with the promise of a seat so long as they kept sowing those $20 seeds every week and don't cause no ruckus. Yeah, it's one thing to feed the poor out of your own building fund, but it's another to demand that the feds do their part to make that happen. Don't do that. That's the part that became taboo during this period. Even people like post-civil rights Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton never actively worked against the system when it wasn't popular. Rather, what they did was address the symptoms to varying degrees of efficacy and with dubious motives depending on who you talk to. Also, both of them are probably fed, so yeah, that's probably not an insignificant part of their prominence, control, opposition, and all that. But whatever. What I'm getting at is the tale of the black church is and always has been a tale of two sisters. One who desperately wanted to sit at the cool kids table and the other who wanted to flip it over. And even if they fought, they were never in a position to deny the other until one day the older sister filled out over one summer and suddenly started getting attention from the jocks and mean girls. Because, I mean, let's be real. Girls love titties too, even more than the boys, to be honest. As I said in the oldest video on this channel that I keep bringing up, it was the unequivocal blackness of Pentecostalism that turned a lot of people off from it until they figured out how to whitewash it. Matter of fact, C.H. Mason's unapologetic pride in the slave religion he grew up with was and still is a primary source of ridicule for both him and Kojic today. In a lot of ways, that one bougie sister got exactly what she wanted. Because if you remove the praise breaks, remove the hooping preachers, remove the Friday night fish fries and the perpetual building fund, what made the black church was the blackness of its politics. If you remove that, then what really separates black theology from white Christianity? Nothing besides the aesthetic. And the sad part is that's what a lot of folk wanted from jump. And now the whole of Western Christianity is what King prophesied in that letter. Nothing more than a thermometer, a pulse read on popular opinion rather than the dictator of it. Or actually, it's become something even worse. Since the 80s, American nationalism has become the face of Western Christianity. And so, for better or worse, that's what folks see when they hear Christian. And again, that's nobody's fault but the church. Somewhere between there's a miracle with your name on it and relationship goals, we lost the plot, is what I'm saying. And in the process, the black church lost its relevancy. And the reason we lost the plot was the allure of consumerism. It was just too much to look past. The black church sacrificed its soul for the sake of assimilation, a process as old as AME. But the promise was a monkey's paw. They took the shout, they took the hoop, they took the sound, they even took the speaking of tongues, but they left the doctrine with us, one that we don't even practice ourselves anymore. So I gotta ask you, black church, you finally got a seat at the cool kids table, but what did it cost you? Well, if it's anything close to what it cost Trinity, it costs you everything. Don't forget to give to the building fund. But with all that being said, I gotta ask, man, if we're critiquing the church from a purely sociological perspective, how is it any different than any other American institution? How is the way the church and its leaders capitulate to popular culture any different from what politicians, even academia, does? Remember when the squad was supposed to save the Democratic Party from itself and be the vanguard of a new wave of progressive legislators? Yeah, how did that turn out? Hey, y'all remember when Republicans actually pretended to have sense? Like I said in the past, I personally believe that the church is subject to a higher power, but I also know that a lot, if not most of y'all, don't even believe that such a power exists. And I mean, to each his own. But again, I gotta ask, why do you specifically, choose to single out the church for its sins? Is it because the harm that the church has done to you and to those closest to you is more direct than what's done by, prisons, police, politicians, whatever? Is it simply because all the cool kids are doing the agnosticism these days and nothing makes you feel better than you ought to than making fun of someone you think is already beneath you? Or is it simply because of the blatant hypocrisy of the whole God says thing? I don't know, man. Honestly, I don't even care, really, to be honest, and it's not even my point. So what is, nigga? Obviously. It's that every society creates God in its own image. It's that the descent of the black church into consumerism is just a reflection of the society in which it exists. So then what does that say about the culture? What does that say about black culture, that the culture's religion's most sacred vessels now are a Bugatti and a Birkin bag. It means we need to find better jobs, nigga.